So the last few years have seen policymakers, parents, and psychologists worry over the effects of social media. In the last decade and a half, since social media use has become more widespread, suicides have increased, with particular attention to teen girl suicides. Our political polarization has gotten worse. Big companies, universities, and politicians oftentimes pay attention to social media outrages as if these represented a societal consensus on issues of particular importance. Most of us would agree that the social media age has come with some particular challenges. Most of us would also agree that social media can be fun, can open us up to new information we couldn't otherwise access, can allow us to make connections, can help us publicize our work. So there definitely are some good things that we can balance with the bad when we talk about social media. We all have some kind of intuitive sense of what we think social media does and does not do. Unfortunately, our intuition differs from person to person, which means that it's not very reliable. Some people think that social media is the devil's gift to children and should be banned from their lives. Other people think that it's basically harmless. People of my age or older, or my generation and older, didn't grow up with social media. So this is a very new experience for us. And we're trying to figure out a bunch of different questions, like, for instance, how should we raise healthy kids in this new technological age? How do we function as a body politic without hating one another? Fortunately, science can oftentimes help us answer some of these questions, to understand where our concerns are well-founded and where we may need to put some attention and resources, and where sometimes perhaps our fears are less reasonable and we don't need to worry so much. So what I hope to do with this talk today is to talk a little bit about the science of social media, looking at two particular issues in question. First, mental health, and then political polarization. So let's start with mental health. Most of us who are parents have some sense that allowing our kids to be glued to screens all day is probably not wise. We prefer that they spend their time outside looking at trees, something that we never did when we were kids. To older adults, trees are fascinating, probably because we're peers. We're all basically the same age. We also were there when the mountains were raised up. Unfortunately, kids oftentimes find the outside world to be much duller and uninteresting. They always have. When I was a kid, I mostly spent my time inside playing video games and Dungeons and Dragons. If we look at the data on suicide, we find that indeed suicides among teen girls have risen in the last decade and a half. But this has to be considered in the context that suicides among teen girls were actually pretty rare to begin with. In fact, contrary to most people's preconceptions, suicides among teenagers are relatively uncommon compared to certain other age groups. In particular, we look at the data, two groups stand out as being particularly high in suicide rates and seeing in particular increases in suicide over the last decade and a half. And those are respectively mid-20s Native American men and early 50s Caucasian men, such as myself. Now, I'm not making a cry for help here. I'm simply pointing out that we oftentimes have a misunderstanding of the basic question at hand. The whole debate over social media and suicide oftentimes reminds me of the old Indian parable of the blind man and the elephant. If you haven't heard this before, it basically kind of goes like this. A group of blind men are traveling together and they happen upon an elephant somewhere in a clearing, and they all start reaching out, touching different parts of the elephant, trying to understand exactly what is this thing that they have discovered. You have to imagine a really patient elephant in the story, by the way. The gentleman who finds the trunk thinks that he has found a snake. The individual who's touching the tail believes that he has found a rope. Eventually, these guys all come to blows with each other, thinking that the others must be liars. This sounds a lot like Twitter, to some extent. The moral of the story, of course, is that we can oftentimes develop a very passionate sense of the absolute truthfulness of our own experience without realizing that we, in fact, only have one piece of a larger picture. And so it seems to be when we look at the data on suicide. If we look specifically at teen girls, it makes some intuitive sense to wonder whether social media may be fostering this increase in suicides. But if we take a broader look and dial back a little bit, and we see that, in fact, the increase in suicides is greater among Native American men and middle-aged white men, then it seems that maybe something else may be going on here. Last year, a large group of media psychologists in the United States, United Kingdom, and Ireland, including myself, conducted a meta-analysis where we combined studies together in a research field to look for overall patterns in the data. What we found was that the associations between using social media and mental health were very weak, in fact. They were roughly the same size as you find when you look for associations between things like eating potatoes and reduced mental health, or wearing eyeglasses and reduced mental health. But we don't run around warning parents about the dangers of letting their kids eat potatoes or wear eyeglasses. Effect sizes in this range are largely indistinguishable from statistical noise. Indeed, when I've conducted studies of teenagers and their mental health and their suicidal ideation, I find, generally speaking, that their media use, whether we're talking about social media or television shows with suicide themes, such as 13 Reasons Why, are generally not associated with their mental health. In fact, 13 Reasons Why was associated with better mental health in teenagers. If we want to understand why some teenagers have mental health problems, we need to understand that the biggest predictors of teenage mental health issues tend to be exposure to bullying and experiencing suicide in the family of origin or in their peer group. Now, there are some nuances in the data. Most of us use things like Facebook, which is social media for old people, in order to brag about our beautiful wives, our awesome cars, or how good we are on guitar. This may be obnoxious to other people, but it's actually associated with relatively positive outcomes in terms of mental health. On the other hand, some people go on social media and compare themselves negatively to others. And as you might suspect, this is associated with reduced mental health. So sometimes how we use social media is more important than the time we spend on it. It's not as simple as banning the technology for teenagers. And we can understand our obsessiveness with the evils of social media in light of past moral panics over media and technology. And we can remember some of these. Back in the 1940s, people were petrified of the impact of the radio on youth. In the 1950s, the attention has shifted to comic books, which people were worried would cause not only delinquency, but homosexuality, because Batman and Robin are secretly gay. By the 1980s, the focus had moved to rock music. Cyndi Lauper, in her song She Bop, was singing about masturbation. And we can't have teens running around masturbating in the streets, something they surely would only have discovered with Cyndi Lauper's help. Nowadays, nobody cares about Cyndi Lauper. The average age of a person at one of her concerts is something like 104. By the 90s, we'd moved on to video games, and then finally, here we are at social media. When we get older, there seems to be a relatively natural phenomenon where we develop a suspiciousness of new technology or media that kids are embracing. This has literally been going on at least since Plato's ancient Athenians worried about the delinquency effects of Greek plays that we now have to force kids to read. So this overall suggests that, at least on this issue, maybe our concerns are less well-founded than we had thought. Maybe science is telling us we don't need to worry so much about technology. Maybe we don't need to worry about the radio or comic books or rock music or video games or social media. But science could sometimes also tell us where maybe there are some concerns we need to focus some attention and resources on. And with that in mind, I'm now going to turn to the issue of political polarization. For political polarization, things are more complex. It is absolutely true that many politicians and big businesses either live in fear of or cynically manipulate social media, particularly Twitter. And this is probably a bad thing in many respects. It can cause misinformation on both the left and the right of our political spectrum. Many ideas that people passionately embrace, whether the QAnon or Stop the Steal conspiracies on the right, or the beliefs that the United States is uniquely racist, or that there's a police genocide of black people on the left, is largely the product of social and news media misinformation. Oftentimes, the underlying issues are much more nuanced and complex, but this gets lost in a social media culture of outrage, conformity, and virtue signaling. When we look at the actual data, there's good news and bad news on polarization. The good news is that for most people, spending time on social media does not necessarily increase polarization. The bad news is for people that are already highly polarized, social media can increase that polarization. Worse, social media can amplify and give undue influence to the most extreme positions in our society. The truth is, most people aren't on Twitter. And of the people who are on Twitter, a relatively small number of individuals produce most of the posts that are on that medium. To the extent that big businesses and universities and politicians pay attention to that narrow sliver of our society, many of whom have non-trivial mental health issues, and believe that they represent a consensus on societal issues, that can cause real harm. On the right, this can cause things like the type of provocation that can lead to the January 6th riot. On the left, the evidence suggests that even the brief moment in 2020 when defund the police went unchallenged resulted in increased homicides in many low-income neighborhoods. So science can tell us once again that if we're going to worry about social media effects, perhaps what we need to spend our time worrying about are the social policy effects of social media, not the mental health effects. We can think of social media less as an aggressive invading interloper like the Skynet of the Terminator movies, and more as a grimy mirror, oftentimes casting an unflattering reflection of our own worst instincts. So, then, what can we do? First, anything we do with social media needs to be considered in light of the first principles of free speech and the First Amendment. Even when there are legitimate problems, we can't ban our way out of them. You have to remember that censorship has never resulted in improvements in society, and the Supreme Court has argued that even juveniles enjoy significant First Amendment protections. Second, we all need to stop taking social media so seriously. What happens on Twitter isn't real. It turns out people lie, exaggerate, morally grandstand, and just make crap up on social media. When people are accused of things on social media, we need to understand that they may not actually have done what they've been accused of doing. Very oftentimes, in fact, that is true. We should welcome an impartial investigation of serious accusations, but we're long past the point of thinking that somebody must be guilty because they've been accused of something. Third, unless you've really done something wrong, stop apologizing for speaking your mind. Social media is full of bullies that are trying to get people to apologize for having opinions. If you apologize on social media, you will not be forgiven, because that is not how social media works. And you may actually contribute to the phenomenon of online bullying. It turns out, as a basic principle of psychology, if people engage in a particular behavior and you give them what they want, they tend to do that behavior more. So if you're going to be on social media, grow a backbone. And that's particularly true for people in positions of power who can do real damage by overreacting to online drama. Fourth, we can all make the social media experience just a little bit better. Don't get into stupid fights on social media. There are no prizes for winning. Learn to disengage. Use mute, block, and unfollow buttons for people who are unpleasant. Don't let yourself be goaded into saying something that you will later regret. And yes, there are people on social media who are trying to get you to do exactly this. Learn that other people can have vastly different opinions from yours and aren't horrible people. Learn how to steelman rather than strawman the positions of others. Listen openly and assume good faith. Debate cordially and use sarcasm less, something that I need to learn how to do better myself. Don't go after people's jobs because they posted something that made you angry. Stop throwing around words like Nazism and communism and racism and snowflakeism and transphobia and groomerism, etc., like they're candy. You ever been in an argument with someone and they called you an asshole? Did you listen to them more after they did so? Lastly, if you're on social media and you find that you're not having fun, just get off. Even if just for a while. Take a walk. Touch grass, as the kids like to say. If you're angry, you may find yourself posting something that at best will later embarrass you and at worst may cause you real problems with your job or school. Humiliating some random person in Idaho or Vietnam or Russia or Brazil just is not worth it. The truth is that the social media world is here to stay, and your kids are going to be on it in one form or another, at least until something scarier comes along. There's really nothing that we can do about that. I've never seen a successful effort to roll back technology to some previous era of innocent children playing outside and respecting their elders. It just doesn't happen. So the good news, though, is that, again, science sometimes can tell us where some of our concerns maybe what we're worried about isn't really going to be as bad as we think. Maybe the future is coming, right? It's not going to be so bad. And if we're being honest, the past wasn't that good anyway. Remember polio? Sometimes it's okay to be able to sit back, relax by the pool, sip a pina colada, and let time take the responsibility for managing our culture off of our hands. So the social media age has brought with it some significant challenges. They haven't always been the challenges we thought they were going to be, but I remain optimistic that if we keep focused on the data and level-headed in our assessments, we can meet those challenges effectively. Until then, I hope you've enjoyed this talk and look forward to seeing you on Instagram.